December 2006. 60 years after the end of the Second World War, Britain makes its final payment for the war. Not to Germany, not to any victim of the Blitz, but to the United States of America. It is a quiet transfer, about $83 million. It is the last installment of a loan that has haunted British budgets for generations. In school textbooks and Hollywood films, the story is simple. America rode to the rescue. The arsenal of democracy saved Britain from Nazi Germany. But behind the heroism and rhetoric, another story unfolded, a financial story. A story about loans, about conditions, and about who would rule the world economy after the smoke cleared. Did the United States save Britain, or did it quietly send the British Empire into bankruptcy? This is the story of the secret bill for World War II, and how paying it helped end one empire and crown another. In 1939, when Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, it was still officially the world's greatest empire. It ruled roughly a quarter of the globe, and nearly 500 million people lived under the Union Jack. From India to Africa, from the Middle East to the Pacific, trade routes, railways, and shipping lines all fed back into London. On a map, the British Empire looked invincible. But this empire was already cracked. The First World War had shattered Britain's finances. The country had borrowed heavily, sold off investments, and sacrificed a generation. By the 1930s, London was less the undisputed banker of the world and more an overdrawn account with a very fancy address. Yet when war came again, Britain promised to fight, not just for itself, but, as Winston Churchill declared, for freedom and civilization. There was only one problem. Modern war ran on oil, steel, food, and manufactured goods, and most of that now came from across the Atlantic. The United States was neutral. It sold to Britain, but only on strict cash and carry terms. Britain had to pay in dollars or gold. There was no credit. By the end of 1940, Britain had burned through most of its gold and dollar reserves. Just 15 months into what would become a 6-year war, the empire was almost broke. The choice was brutal. Britain could stop buying American weapons and risk losing the war, or it could hand the future to Washington and ask for help on America's terms. In late 1940, the British government sent a desperate message to Washington. It could no longer pay for the weapons and supplies it needed. President Franklin Roosevelt believed Britain must survive. He understood that if Britain fell, Nazi Germany might dominate Europe and threaten the United States. But he also knew something else. The old economic order centered on the British Empire had to die. For a century, London had dominated global finance. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The empire ran on an exclusive network of trade preferences, tariffs, shipping rules, and currency controls that favored British goods and British shipping. To American planners, this imperial web looked like a cage. It locked out US exporters and tied global trade to a power they saw as declining. Their solution was elegant, at least from Washington's point of view. America would become the arsenal of democracy. It would send weapons, food, and fuel to countries fighting the Axis. But instead of asking for gold, it would ask for something much more valuable: influence over the shape of the post-war world. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend Lease Act. On paper, it sounded extraordinarily generous, almost absurdly so. Roosevelt compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. You would not sell him the hose, you would lend it so his house would not burn down and threaten yours. Under Lend Lease, the United States would lend destroyers, tanks, aircraft, trucks, food, and oil. The Allies would return or pay for whatever was left when the war ended. In reality, Lend Lease was far more than a friendly loan. It was a financial life support system, and the price was not written only in dollars. Hidden in the diplomatic language of the Lend Lease agreements was a key provision known as Article VII. It called for the end of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. In plain English, this meant that Britain would have to dismantle its imperial trade preferences and open its markets after the war. So the United States would save Britain from the Nazis, but in exchange, Britain would promise to dismantle the economic system that had powered its empire. Throughout the war, nearly half of all US Lend-Lease aid went to Britain and its empire. By 1945, that aid totaled over $30 billion, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. Every ship that arrived with American food, fuel, and weapons was another thread tying Britain to its new creditor. The garden hose was saving the house. But somewhere in Washington, someone was already writing the bill.
In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. London erupted in joy. Nazi Germany was defeated. Churchill waved to cheering crowds, and people filled Trafalgar Square. But inside the British Treasury, there was no celebration, only spreadsheets and fear. Even in victory, Britain was exhausted. A quarter of its national wealth had been destroyed. Factories, ports, and houses lay in ruins. The country still imported around half its food, and the war against Japan was not yet over. Britain remained dependent on imported supplies, especially from the United States. Then, without warning, the lifeline was cut. In May and June 1945, the United States abruptly halted most Lend-Lease shipments to Britain. Orders already loaded onto ships were cancelled. Supplies sitting on docks were frozen. Lend-Lease, which had looked like an endless flow, stopped almost overnight. For British officials, this was a shock. They had assumed Lend-Lease would taper off gradually after victory in Europe. Instead, it was switched off. President Harry Truman and the US Congress faced pressure to reduce spending and focus on domestic concerns. With Germany defeated, many in Washington saw little reason to keep feeding the British Empire. Britain suddenly faced a terrifying gap between what it needed to import and what it could afford to buy. It had to find a new source of credit, fast. In late 1945, Britain sent its most famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, to Washington to negotiate. The man who had revolutionized economic theory now had to plead for a loan. Keynes argued that Britain had sacrificed everything to defeat Hitler: its gold reserves, many of its overseas investments, its cities, and its young men. Surely, he said, America would offer generous terms to its closest ally. The Americans saw it differently. To them, this was their moment to redesign the world economy. The resulting deal, signed in December 1945, was called the Anglo American Financial Agreement. It granted Britain a $3.75 billion loan from the United States and another $1.19 billion loan from Canada. The loans were to be repaid over 50 years with a low interest rate. The rhetoric around the agreement was friendly. The loans were presented as acts of partnership between allies, but, as before, the conditions were the real story. Britain had to accept the end of most imperial trade preferences. It had to commit to making the pound sterling convertible into US dollars. This meant that countries holding sterling could demand dollars at a fixed rate, and dollars were the scarce, crucial currency of the post-war world. In July 1947, sterling convertibility began. Almost immediately, panic set in. Countries rushed to exchange their pounds for dollars. Britain's precious dollar reserves drained away like water from a broken dam. Within just 6 weeks, the experiment had to be abandoned. Sterling was once again locked down. The crisis was humiliating for the British government. The message was clear. The City of London was no longer the unquestioned heart of global finance. The pound was no longer king. The British Empire had won the war, but it had lost its credit. After 1945, ordinary British people imagined that peace would bring prosperity, full shops, better housing, and more comfort after years of hardship. Instead, they discovered something different: austerity. Bread, meat, and sugar remained rationed for years after the war. In fact, some foods were harder to obtain in peace than in wartime. Rationing in Britain continued until 1954. In some ways, life felt harsher after victory than during the conflict itself. Why did this happen? Because Britain's new mission was not to run an empire. It was to earn dollars. The government launched an export or die campaign. Factories that had once made goods for imperial markets were pushed to sell to the United States and other hard currency markets. Everything Britain could manufacture and export abroad had to go. Exports paid for food imports. They serviced dollar debts. They helped keep the pound from collapsing. By the end of the war, Britain's national debt exceeded 200% of its annual national income. This burden was worse than after the First World War, and worse than during the Great Depression. The paradox was stark. Britain had emerged from the war a military victor, but an economic cripple. And that debt burden would soon begin to reshape the map of the world. In 1939, Britain ruled from Cairo to Calcutta, from Singapore to Sierra Leone. By the mid-1960s, most of that red on the map had disappeared. India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence in 1947. Pakistan followed. Burma and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, soon did the same. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, colonial territories became independent states. Historians debate the reasons for this imperial retreat. They talk about anti-colonial movements, war weariness, and changing moral values. All of those mattered. But one driver was simply arithmetic. The empire had become too expensive to maintain, especially for a country struggling with huge debts and a constant need for dollars. Meanwhile, the world's financial architecture was being reshaped. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the Allies agreed to a new international monetary system. Most currencies would be pegged to the US dollar. The dollar alone would be convertible into gold. This arrangement made the American dollar the center of gravity in the post-war economy. For Imperial Britain, this was a quiet revolution. Before the war, much of the world had been tied to the sterling area. Countries held their reserves in pounds and settled trade through London. Sterling was the anchor of a closed imperial financial system. After the war, Washington wanted global trade to flow through a dollar-centered system instead. It demanded open markets and non-discriminatory trade rules. It wanted to end the special advantages that British goods enjoyed inside the empire. In agreement after agreement, Lend Lease, the Anglo American loan, and the new trade pacts, British officials were pushed to dismantle the rules that had once protected imperial commerce. Sometimes London resisted. British diplomats tried to defend what remained of imperial preference. But each time Britain needed more dollars, it had to compromise. Colonies were no longer just territories. They were potential sources of dollar earnings. The Middle East, with its vast oil reserves, became a strategic obsession, not only for Britain, but for the United States. Oil exports could bring in dollars. Control over oil routes and production could shape the entire global economy. As British troops withdrew from bases across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, American forces and influence often moved in to replace them. The flags changed. The struggle for global influence continued, but under a different financial and political leader. The empire had paid its bills, in blood and in money. In doing so, it had signed away the system that had kept it dominant. If there was a single moment when Britain discovered the true cost of its dependence on American credit, it came in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. In July 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal. For Britain and France, this canal was a vital artery for Middle Eastern oil and imperial trade. Outraged, Britain and France secretly plotted with Israel to retake the canal by force. Their plan was to have Israeli forces invade Sinai, then have British and French troops intervene, supposedly to separate the combatants and protect the canal. Militarily, They succeeded at first. Israeli troops advanced. British and French paratroopers landed. Naval forces bombarded Egyptian positions. On the ground, the operations seemed to work, but they had miscalculated who truly controlled their fate. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious at the invasion. He believed Suez threatened to push the Arab world toward the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. He had not been informed in advance and saw the operation as reckless. More importantly, the United States held a terrifying financial weapon. Britain's economy was still fragile. Its currency, the pound sterling, depended heavily on confidence in New York and Washington. If foreign holders of sterling lost faith and sold their pounds, the currency could collapse. The US government quietly threatened to sell its own holdings of sterling and to block Britain's access to emergency assistance from the International Monetary Fund. For Britain, this was the equivalent of financial nuclear war. If the United States dumped pounds and prevented the IMF from helping, the pound could crash. Imports would become unaffordable. The entire British economy could spiral into crisis. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden and his cabinet held a flurry of late-night meetings. They faced a stark reality. Britain might still have tanks and planes, but it did not control the financial oxygen it needed to breathe. Within days, Britain and France agreed to withdraw their forces from Egypt. The Suez adventure collapsed. The message to the world was unmistakable. Britain was no longer an independent great power. It could not go to war without at least the consent of its chief creditor. The empire had paid its bill, and in doing so, it had put itself under the financial authority of another state. The Anglo American loan and related wartime debts were scheduled to be repaid over 50 years. In practice, not every payment was made on time. Britain postponed some installments in the 1950s and 1960s during periods of balance of payments crisis. But the obligation never disappeared. In 1967, the British government devalued the pound. It officially admitted that the pound was weaker and could no longer be maintained at its previous exchange rate against the dollar. This was another blow to Britain's financial prestige. In the 1970s, as oil prices spiked and domestic unrest grew, Britain's economic problems deepened. Inflation rose, growth slowed, strikes spread. In 1976, the British government was forced to request a major loan from the International Monetary Fund. Once again, foreign creditors were in a position to set conditions and influence domestic policy. North Sea oil in the 1980s seemed to offer a way out. Revenues from offshore oil fields provided a new source of income and foreign currency. But even that windfall did not erase the long shadow of wartime borrowing and structural weakness. By the early 21st century, the original sums of the Anglo American loan no longer looked enormous in a world of trillion-dollar economies. Yet symbolically, the debt still mattered. In December 2006, the United Kingdom made its final scheduled payment to the United States and Canada on the loans that had been agreed in the 1940s. There were no parades to mark the occasion, no grand speeches in Parliament, just a line item in a budget report and a short press release. With that quiet transfer, Britain closed the account it had opened in 1940 when it first turned to America and admitted it could no longer pay. The physical war had lasted 6 years. The financial aftershock had lasted more than 60. How should we judge America's role in this story? On one hand, without US industrial might, Britain might not have survived 1940 and 1941. American ships, planes, food, and fuel were crucial to defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Millions of American citizens fought and died in that struggle. On the other hand, US policymakers were fully aware of the leverage they held. They saw British weakness as an opportunity to reshape the global economy. They wanted open markets, a dollar-centered system, and the dismantling of what they viewed as the closed shop of the British Empire. They wanted to ensure that after the war, the rules of international trade and finance would be written in Washington, not in London. Did they deliberately bankrupt the British Empire? In one sense, no complicated conspiracy was necessary. The empire was already financially exhausted. Democratic pressure at home, independence movements abroad, and the sheer cost of modern war were all tearing it apart. In another sense, the United States absolutely used its leverage. It tied aid to conditions. It insisted that Britain accept a future in which Washington, not London, set the rules of global trade and money. The bill for victory was not just a number on a balance sheet. It was a new world order. Today, we live in the world that those wartime bargains created. The US dollar remains the dominant global currency. International institutions born in the 1940s, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization's predecessors, still shape how nations borrow, trade, and grow. Britain, once the world's banker and imperial center, is now a medium-sized power. It is still negotiating its place in an international order that it helped design but no longer controls. World War II offers a quiet lesson about power. Empires rarely die in one final glorious battle. More often, they die by degrees, by losing control of their credit, of their currency, and of the rules that govern global trade. The most expensive part of a war may not be the weapons or the casualties. It may be the bill that arrives decades later, written into treaties, loans, and the fine print of a new financial system. So what do you think? Did the United States fairly reshape a broken world, or did it use Britain's hour of need to quietly bankrupt an empire? Was this the price of survival, or the cost of surrender? Let me know in the comments.